Hello, everyone, and welcome to our plenary conversation about gender equality and democracy. The speakers of the next session are going to share examples and insights to demonstrate what happens when governments fail to protect the rights of women in their societies. I am so honored to have these esteemed speakers with us here today. Please click on their bios in Whova so that you can see their extensive backgrounds. I want to give plenty of time for the speakers, so I'm going to turn it over to Jane Barry to moderate. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Jane Barry. I'm the Executive Director of the Linksbridge Foundation. And for a little bit of brief background, I have worked for about 3 decades in international human rights and humanitarian response, with a particular focus on gender equality and the protection of human rights defenders globally. And that is why it is a particular honor today to be able to moderate this panel on gender equality and democracy, and to introduce you to, honestly, some of the finest human rights and humanitarian activists I've ever had the pleasure to meet and to work with. So to introduce you to, we have Najla Ayoubi, who is a lawyer and former judge from Afghanistan, who is now with the Every Woman Treaty. We have Maxman, who is the CEO and president of Oxfam America. And we have Marina Pisklakova-Parker, who is the founder and the board chair for the Anna Center for the Prevention of Violence in Russia. So the objectives of our panel today is, well, we will be talking about 2 key topics. And the first is around what happens when governments fail to protect the rights of the women in their society. Because, as we know, recent events in Afghanistan, Russia, Myanmar, Ethiopia, Yemen, the list goes on. These are all political conflicts, but really, honestly, also human rights conflicts that have transformed and morphed into humanitarian crises. And these are crises that have put women, girls, gender non-binary people at great risk and left them unprotected by the governments that should protect them. So that's really the first topic that we'll be talking about. And the second topic is around the movements that are fighting for gender equality around the world, as well as the power of civil society to protect the rights of women, particularly when the institutions that are supposed to protect them cannot and often will not. So without further ado, I'd love to jump right into our first question to our panel. And if we can go ahead and turn on our video and unmute. Let me introduce the first question to the 3 of you. Hello. So I'd love to kind of ground our question in a little bit of time, because this is December, and December is a very important human rights month. All months are important human rights months, but we have, in particular in December, we have the amazing global campaign of 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. And tomorrow is International Human Rights Day. So it's firmly within that context that we want to talk about human rights and the responsibility of governments, because we know ultimately it is the responsibility of the state, the responsibility of governments to protect the rights of women, girls, and non-binary people in their own countries. But all around the world, from Afghanistan to Russia to elsewhere, we're seeing governments that are failing to protect their people. And in the end, it's ordinary citizens that end up having to step up and respond. So I'd love to hear from our panel, from each of your past experiences in this context. What changes have you seen in civil society's role and ability to protect human rights and gender equality, both globally and nationally? And why don't we go ahead and start, why don't we start with Abby?
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. And I am truly humbled to be here with you all today alongside Marina and Najla, such remarkable women's rights leaders. And I was privileged to be with Marina earlier this week, where she was amongst 5 extraordinary honorees of the Hillary Rodham Clinton Award for Advancing Women in Peace and Security. She probably doesn't want me to say that, but it's so important and relevant to this conversation and their service to human rights. And we recall that seminal moment at the 4th Annual Conference of Women in Beijing in 1995 with those landmark words: women's rights are human rights. Human rights are women's rights. And we've seen extraordinary progress. And I've seen, along with you all over the course of my 30+ years of work globally and nationally, real progress, but we're seeing a worrying trend. And the progress made is under extreme threat, and civil society's essential role in the fight for these rights is under attack. So that two-pronged piece of your question, what is the role and what's the ability to protect rights globally and nationally? There's 2 interconnected changes or trends that are worth flagging that we're witnessing. Civil society and movements for protecting women's rights, gender justice, climate justice, human rights, are critical agents of change, and thus they are more feared than ever by power holders. So the role is essential and the ability is being constrained, though I know the panelists I'm with have experienced threats over the course of a lifetime, but we're seeing some real trends in that regard. And what's troubling me most about this is we have an evidence base and know this to be true, that when women and girls have a voice and choice and can live lives free of violence, that families and communities and societies at large are healthier and wealthier and safer and more secure for everyone. And yet we're seeing this tension, this rise of attacks on rights, a rise in authoritarianism and nationalism and otherisms, scapegoatings and fear-mongering, among, as you said, Jane, refugees, people of color, people with disabilities, women, LGBTQIA+ communities, those who work to protect and defend those rights, civil society, women's rights organizations, human rights organizations are under attack. And I'll just say one more thing before I pass over. Right now, we're seeing an onslaught of anti-civil society laws and regulations against a broader context of shrinking civic space. And in 2021, it marked the 15th consecutive year of democratic backsliding and decline in global freedom. And that started with trends that I witnessed when I was working in Ethiopia in the early 2000s, new legislations coming in that intentionally restrict civil society, prohibit use of the words of rights and empowerment. And then obviously other burdensome, bureaucratic and other intimidative attacks, criminalization, revocation of licenses. We at Oxfam were thrown out of Nicaragua recently, increased direct risk to individuals' lives and livelihoods. And when you think about COVID and its impact and restrictive environments in India, how that had an effect. We were able to respond, but still there's this evidence of the impact of closing civic space on even saving lives.
Abby, thank you so much for that. I'd love to hear more from Marina, if we can hear your perspective as well. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you so much, Abby. Thank you, Jane. And thank you, everybody. It's very nice to be here. I just want to actually pick up on what Abby started, putting so like really global picture and come like narrow it to, for example, our region and our and Russia as an example. I can tell you that these trends we were able to see specifically very brightly during the lockdown. Last year during the lockdown, when like all state agencies were basically closed for victims and survivors of violence, of domestic violence and other forms of violence, frontline activists and NGOs were and are still the first ones to respond to violence. So what we are doing, we are providing legal services, shelters, counseling, writing letters to the government asking, demanding that women who flee home because of violence, that they are not fined for a violation of the lockdown rules. So we are doing all of that. And at the same time, we are underfunded, we are threatened, and there is no investigation of threats against activists. Government doesn't investigate, doesn't stop radical groups who criticize and attack activists. So we are between like really these two extreme situations. On the one hand, where we feel responsible. For example, helpline of my organization within 2 months received 74% more calls than in the previous months. Like it really skyrocketed numbers. And at the same time, Russian Ministry of Interior reported 9% decrease in domestic violence. Guess why? Because women simply didn't feel safe to call there, and they knew that there will be no response. So they were taking really their lives in their hands, risking lives, getting out of the houses and apartments, but looking for shelters and trusting their lives to NGOs. So this is a very actually typical picture. Unfortunately, even in those countries where there is good system of response, it still was not enough. And that's why we see this, shadow pandemic. That's why we see so much increase. And at the same time, when we look at the global funding on prevention of violence against women, I mean, to say it's not enough, it's just to say nothing. When I found this number from the Equality Institute, that funding for prevention of violence against women in the past 5 years is only 0.002% of the global development programs. Let's think about that. How much actually can be done by activists on the ground with no funding, no protection, and often with no even legislative framework. So that's my view, which totally coincides with what you, Abby, described globally.
Marina, thank you so much for that. Najla, I would like to turn to you to hear from your perspective on the question.
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you. I'm also happy to be here and among you. I echo what Abby and Marina mentioned, but I would like to add another piece to it, because the important piece is that civil society become a threat to the government, because they cannot tolerate how we are bringing the evidences out, and we are working, providing services on behalf of the government, that this is the government role to play. But unfortunately, because of bringing all of these evidences out, and also being the voices of the voiceless people, that's why we became a threat. At the same time, once you become a threat, then you become a target. So a best example is, unfortunately, an unfortunate example is Afghanistan. So for instance, we were providing services for over 40% of the country, because government, because of this security, ex-government, and now of course with the Taliban, many people don't have access to those services, from the health to the education to providing shelters to the domestic violence and violence against women victims and survivors, and all the other things. And I agree with my colleagues that here that the space is also shrinking around the civil society. More restrictions are there around by the government, because they're hiding their own, because they're not taking actions. That's why we are the one that we are becoming more vocal about certain things. And at the same time, I think I'm bringing again Afghanistan example because I feel that we have changed, the civil society also have changed, because now we have more collective, bringing more collective evidences, collecting evidences, and also calling for action collectively. Like, for instance, our grassroots organizations, we are working with over 840 civil society organizations around the globe with the Every Woman Treaty. And then we are the one that we are bringing more of the voices of the people, particularly looking into collecting the evidences about the types of the violence against women, about what is working, what is not working, what is the global framework. If it's not working, what else, what can be the alternative to that. So it means that we have a collective voice and calling for actions on the government. But at the same time, I feel another piece that it's really strikes me, that even the global community is also silent about what is really happening in Afghanistan. We don't see any voices, unfortunately, that to at least to bring hope to Afghan people, civil society, women's rights defenders, human rights defenders, what to do, what will be the next steps for us, because all of us are out of the country, many of us left in the country under the very restricted rules of the Taliban. So what can be done in the coming future, not only from the government side, from the global policymakers, but also civil society actors, what they can do to help us to get out of this situation.
Thank you so much, Najla. We will also, in our next question, be returning to Afghanistan again, so we'll be able to continue with that. So moving on to our next question for our panelists, let's go ahead and start with Marina. Marina, you've been fighting for gender equality in Russia and the former Soviet Union for over 30 years now. Can you describe why and how you and others came together to support women's rights in crisis and build your national network, as well as the government's response?
Yes, thank you, Jane. Well, you know, as Abby mentioned, when the award ceremony was taking place last Monday for Hillary Rodham Clinton Award, we were talking and referring a lot to the Beijing conference. And I can tell you that the Beijing conference did make a significant difference in how I started viewing the issue of violence against women, because in the beginning, I was a service provider, crisis center for women in Moscow. But then I've learned that domestic violence and other forms of violence, these are women's human rights violations. And that actually we have a right to demand a different action, like action on behalf of the government, that we do need legislation, because non-action from government is indirectly supporting violence. And that it really made a significant difference, as well as a greatest tool that came out of the Beijing conference, the Beijing Platform of Action. And the uniqueness of that platform is that it was a united response globally to gender equality, to gender inequality, because 189 countries signed it. So we do have this global experience. And of course, the same was happening in Russia. Russia did sign it. We had national plans, and that was really a very promising time. And that's when our movement started really growing. But then things started to slide, and unfortunately, you know, we still don't have a law on domestic violence. We still have a lot of problems with specific cases, because domestic violence is mostly treated as a private prosecution. So there are a lot of problems and obstacles. But as I mentioned in my previous comment, during the pandemic, we actually, because of really tight resources, because of challenges that we started facing in a very like short period of time, we came all together. We became much more coordinated. We have much more solidarity and we have much more coordination in responding to even separate cases. So we coordinate legal support. For example, tomorrow, my organization is launching online, like telephone legal services for victims and survivors of domestic violence. And it is in cooperation with other NGOs and the network of lawyers in Russia. We coordinate our actions together with both state and private shelters. And it is happening also because of all the challenges and difficulties that we have in a state response to different cases of violence against women. So our motivation, so we have basically two motivations. One is recognizing violence against women as human rights violation. And another, we see how state response to in addressing violence against women is weakening and failing, especially during COVID. Not only in Russia, it's globally. And that is why frontline activists and NGOs, we all come together and to be able to provide better services and push for more change within our society.
Thank you, Marina. And that's actually a perfect segue to ask Abby the next question. Abby, Oxfam works on reducing inequalities throughout the world. But from your global perspective, how has the COVID pandemic impacted inequalities and movements for gender equality?
Yeah, it is a segue, and you know, the impact, as Marina already alluded to, is far, wide, and deep. At Oxfam, we've been calling out inequality for years and the relationship between inequality, gender inequality, intersectional inequality. But now, I'll use the word with quotes, thanks to COVID, thanks, the veil has been lifted on just how unequal our world really is. It's more mainstream talking about it. It doesn't mean it's less polarized. I think it's also more polarized, but it's no longer an agitator's advocacy word or set of discussions. But you know, with the veil lifted on how unequal our world really is, we've seen exactly what the virus has laid bare, exacerbating economic and gender and racial and geographic inequalities, many of which intersect in deeply important ways. And we've seen the impact, you know, on the limited progress that we had made on gender equality and women's rights over the past decades, as Marina was talking about, and across every sphere, from health to the economy, security to social protection. The impacts of COVID-19 are exacerbated for women and girls simply by virtue of their sex. And just I'll give a few example areas. Obviously, well, caregiving. The pandemic has really decimated care systems, from schools to daycares, people leaving the workforce. And as a society, we really need to revalue and redistribute unpaid and underpaid care work, primarily carried out by women and girls. Second is around employment. As mentioned, we're seeing those who are more likely to be in the low-paid jobs and sectors to suffer the bigger losses and have to put themselves in harm's way. And just a stat, COVID-19 cost women globally over $800 billion in lost income in 1 year. GBV, gender-based violence, as Marina's life work shows, we've seen those, you know, being at home, we've seen dramatic spikes in violence in the home, and those who are not bringing in the income experiencing increased gender-based violence. And one of those shadow pandemics that Marina mentioned, which leads to one more shadow pandemic that has emerged around hunger, with livelihoods threatened by shutdowns and COVID restrictions. We know that more people will die from hunger than COVID during the pandemic. It's amazing, the statistics, 12,000 people each could be dying each each week from COVID, and the numbers are catastrophic. From hunger, and there's data showing, and we produced a report called the hunger virus during the pandemic that we can share with those interested. But when access to food is limited, women are more likely to go without food to take care of the family first. So a lot going on in the movements. Obviously, in response, we've seen activists from everywhere: Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, Hong Kong, here in the US, stepping up against the threats and standing up to the rollbacks against women's rights, and that disproportionately harm the most marginalized, but also the threats that both Najla and Marina have talked about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Abby. And now would love to also move on to a very pressing issue, an area of the world that is important to all of us, and talk to Najla about your experiences and your thoughts on Afghanistan. So Najla, you're a lawyer, and as a reminder, you're a lawyer and a former judge from Afghanistan, and would love to hear more about the progress made for women in Afghanistan prior to the rise of the Taliban this year, and what this moment in time means for the future. And if there's also time, if there are particular issues that you want to raise that are relevant to this winter.
Thank you so much, Jane. Actually, women and women organization Afghanistan, particularly all civil society in Afghanistan, we have been played a huge role since 2001, and state building starts from the Constitution of Afghanistan, democratic institutions, education. Like all of you know, about 40% of the girls were enrolled into the school, and also civil society development was a huge success for all of us, as well as the freedom of speech was one of the example in the region, because most of the regional countries in the region were kind of trying to just model Afghanistan on the freedom of speech, culture, art, and most important is the women's movement. The organized women's movement has become more kind of a very big achievement. But at the same time, we also work in hard, and women's organization also played a very huge role in mainstreaming equality and in different sectors, particularly in education, health, even in the political participation in parliament, government institutions, media, business, all sectors, and so on. And from legislation perspective, we had, start from the Constitution, as I mentioned, but electoral law, elimination of violence against women law ever in the history of Afghanistan. We had that, was even not only having it, but also implementing it, and also personal status law. All of these and most importantly, I'm not saying we had a perfect situation prior to Taliban, but unfortunately, lots of achievement in the past 20 years have been made, and we tried our best as a right citizen, as a healthy citizen of Afghanistan. And we tried to even provide services on behalf of the government where the government was not able, as I mentioned earlier also. But unfortunately, because of all of those insecurity in Afghanistan, target killing, with all of those issues in suicide attacks and deterioration of the insecurity all over the country, we also hit by the COVID. COVID also had a huge impact on the situation in Afghanistan, particularly in many cases, women were particularly services that had to go for women, but unfortunately redirected to the COVID cases. So at the same time, we were a very good partner with not at the national level, but also with the community, with the global community. Unfortunately, I don't know what happened, but we have been stabbed back. We lost the country, we lost the identity, we lost whatever we invest personally and publicly. So unfortunately, this winter, as people are suffering from hunger, from insecurity. Target killing is very high. Unfortunately, no reports are coming out of Afghanistan. Formally, no international communities taking steps to go and make the Taliban accountable.
Thank you, Najla, so much. We are all thinking about everyone in Afghanistan at this time. So the final question for all of you, this is a lot. You know, it also, I know that all of you are coming at this work from also a personal and professional place. And so I'd really love to hear from each one of you in, you know, what is it? Are you hopeful for the future? And if you are, can you give us an example of what does bring you hope? And let's go ahead and ask Marina that question.
Thank you. Very good question. And it's good to, you know, to think about hope and hopeful future, especially in moments of crisis and suffering, because it gives extra energy to carry on. You know, I can tell you that the events of this week do give me a lot of support, but also, you know, reconnection with the Beijing conference reminded me that our civilization, humanity, can stand up together and make priorities like eliminating gender inequality. And the Beijing conference was a very good example of that. And we are able to achieve progress. So now the next step is climate change. You know, the world is coming together and, you know, moving forward to deal with this crisis. So my hope is that the next step will become a priority to eliminate violence against women and girls globally. That we as a global community will again come all together, and all countries will want to create a new framework and you know, really demonstrate a commitment to eliminating violence that exists on our earth for 1,000 years. This is a question of human rights, and this is a question of justice as well. And that's my hope for the future.
Thank you so much, Marina. Can we move? Abby, tell us what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, this is such an important question, and one I'm sure, like all of you, we're asked this often, you know, because the work we hear the stories, we witness, we work side by side with those who have experienced at times unspeakable, egregious acts of injustice and loss, and at the same time, that's the very thing that gives me hope is, as Marina, you said, I was so privileged to be in community in that reflection and reconnecting around Beijing in 1995. And, you know, just a little, Jane, you and I were in Rwanda together at that time. And, you know, I remember we listened to the shortwave and, you know, women's rights or human rights, thinking about how far things have come. Even though, yes, the backsliding, the rollbacks, the threats, it can be seen as a sign of progress, because the fear is in response to realizing how powerful movements can be. And I think about our next generation. I'm sure all of our incredible activists, kids, friends, family members, everybody out there fighting the important fights of our time for gender justice, economic justice, racial justice, climate justice. And indeed, what gives me strength every day is the countless courageous people like those I'm with today who have really bravely fought injustice and supported neighbors and strangers in times of need, you know, those who flee their homes think of all the Syrian refugee families I've met, survivors of genocide in Rwanda, those who lost their homes, and family members in natural disasters from Haiti to the Philippines, just to name a few. And I am always humbled and awed by the resilience of people and the generosity of spirit who share everything when they don't even have enough of their own. And so our shared humanity is our strength, and compassion is what drives action. And over, I know I'm in good company who've seen the generosity of that human spirit shine through in moments of crisis and injustice. And that really gives me hope.
Abby, thank you so much. Najla, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree with, when you speak about hope, you also make me hopeful, but I'm a very positive and hopeful person. Though there is a lot happened to, particularly in our context, Afghanistan, but I think one of the hope that I found that there is a huge resistance to the dark ideologies. It's no matter which age, which generation, from any walks of life, there is a very high level of resistance against the dark ideologies. And also that gives me hope. And also another piece that I feel always, I repeat myself and I repeat with myself that if Taliban raises with the bad ideas, we human rights activists can rise with the good ideas and peaceful ideas, right? So that's something that really gives me hope. And particularly these extremists are also giving me more hope, more excuse to do more and to fight more and to make this world a better place. Last but not least is, as Marina mentioned, another last hope that I have, and I really call on everybody who's in this call and can talk to anyone else, to create an accountability mechanism and at the global level to end violence against women and girls that we are calling for the global treaty to end violence against women and girls. Because that's the only hope that I, as an Afghan and as an activist, as a citizen of this world, I have in all Afghan women in Afghanistan, in around the world globally, whether this is in Russia, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, or Nigeria, or Canada. No matter where, we really need a universal solution to universal problem.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Najla. And that is, well, a perfect wrap up actually to our panel. I wish we had so much more time to be in community with all of you. But I know that we will need to be wrapping up and handing over to others. I think, we've heard through this panel some tough truths, but some really important inspirations. And I think that it's important as our audience, and we really thank you for being here with us, that you come away with a sense of what we actually can do. And I think that our panelists are telling us that there are many things, many takeaways and things that we can do as global citizens. And I think that one of the things that Abby said in one of the preparations for this call is let's all make sure that in the end, we're on the right side of humanity. And you all have been talking about humanity, and we've moved from the national to the global level. So I think just to reiterate, and be clear, we can and we must end gender-based violence in our lifetime. It's possible, and we can do that globally. And we, as you've all said, we also need to pay attention to the here and now and COVID and the shadow pandemic, and be aware of that and keep that in our minds. And a big part of what we can do, again, as Global Washington members and citizens, is to support our partners nationally in their work in the civil society response to ensuring gender equality and ending gender-based violence. And so we hopefully this is a perfect segue to continuing this conversation, because we will be hearing from next our esteemed colleagues from the Global Fund for Women. So we welcome you to that next session. And again, thank you to all the panelists here.